Welcome to a world of silence, cold floors, and endless chants. Step into the cloistered, candlelit corridors of ancient monastic life, where time stood still, individuality vanished, and each hour belonged not to the self, but to the bell. In this story, we explore the quiet misery behind the stone walls of monasteries where discipline replaced desire, silence crushed self-expression, and daily, in ancient times, becoming a monk was not always a matter of deep spiritual calling. For many, it was a last resort, a way to escape poverty, avoid military service, or fulfill a family's religious duty. Once inside the walls of the monastery, however, the reality quickly set in. A life stripped of individuality, dictated by a relentless and often punishing schedule. Each day began in darkness, long before the sun rose. Monks were awakened by the toll of a bell, not for leisure or conversation, but to begin the first of many prayer sessions known as the Divine Office. These prayers were repeated 7 or 8 times daily, interrupting all activities, regardless of fatigue, illness, or weather. There was no sleeping in, no rest from the burden of routine. The bell controlled time, and time was not theirs to control. After the first prayers came more prayers, then manual labor. The concept of leisure did not exist, and reading, if permitted, was often limited to religious texts, mostly in Latin, a language not all monks were fluent in despite expectations. Silence was not a virtue but a rule. In many orders, speech was discouraged outside of strictly necessary communication. The idea of exchanging thoughts or jokes was considered a distraction from devotion. Gestures or a limited sign language became the only form of interaction in some monasteries. Meals were not a relief but a continuation of monotony. Food was plain, often cold, and devoid of any seasoning. Meat was banned in many monasteries, replaced by root vegetables, grains, and fish when available. There were strict fasting periods that seemed to stretch endlessly, especially during Lent or Advent. Hunger was constant. Eating was done in silence while a fellow monk read scripture aloud. There was no joy in eating, no celebration of sustenance, only sustenance itself. Outside of meals and prayers, the rest of the day was filled with labor. Depending on the monastery's wealth and land holdings, monks might be assigned to farming, beekeeping, copying manuscripts, maintaining buildings, or preparing funerary services. The tasks were not shared equally. Senior monks had more authority and often took lighter roles, while new initiates or those with few connections performed the hardest physical work. Despite the teachings of humility, hierarchy still developed, and favoritism was not unknown. Intellectual work, such as copying texts, was no easier than manual labor. The scriptorium was cold, and writing by hand for hours strained the eyes and back. Mistakes were not tolerated. Some monks spent decades copying the same texts with little variation. Errors in sacred books brought shame, reprimands, and sometimes penance. Monks were expected to live in fear of pride, yet they were also constantly under scrutiny for failing to meet perfection in spiritual and physical duties. Punishment was a core feature of monastic life. The idea of discipline was not abstract, it was literal. For small infractions like arriving late to prayer, speaking out of turn, or showing sloth in labor, monks could be assigned additional duties, denied food, isolated, or subjected to corporal discipline. For more serious offenses, penance could include wearing uncomfortable clothing, sleeping on the floor, or prolonged silence. The strictness varied between monasteries, but all maintained some system of correction, rooted in the belief that suffering purified the soul. The life of a monk demanded the erasure of personal ambition. Individual thoughts and emotions were discouraged. Any expression of dissatisfaction was framed as a temptation of the devil. Desires for comfort, recognition, or intimacy were signs of weakness. Monks were taught to see the world as a place of sin, and even their own bodies as vessels of temptation. This constant psychological war against the self wore down even the most devout. There was no escape either. Leaving the monastery was considered spiritual failure. Those who tried were often brought back, shamed, or excommunicated. The vow of obedience was not just ceremonial, it was binding. Even death did not free monks from the rules, as burial was often a controlled ritual, emphasizing humility to the very end. No tombstones with names or legacies, just rows of anonymous graves or simple wooden markers slowly weathered by time. Monasteries were cold in the winter, hot in the summer, and always drafty. There was little understanding of hygiene. Baths were infrequent. Vermin were common. Robes were rarely washed. Sickness spread quickly, and monks were expected to endure illness with patience, often without proper medical attention. The infirmary, if it existed, was basic at best and more a place to die and then recover. The constant surveillance added another layer of misery. Monks were rarely alone, and their actions were always visible. Solitude, that rare balm of the soul, was considered dangerous unless granted as a privilege for prayer. Privacy was non-existent. Shared dormitories, shared toilets, shared chores. Personal belongings were discouraged, and even sentimental items were deemed distractions. To survive meant conforming entirely, with no space for self-expression or difference. Finally, the promise of spiritual transcendence, the only true reward, often remained elusive. Not every monk felt the presence of God. Many went through years, even lifetimes, filled with doubt. But doubt was dangerous. It had to be hidden, suppressed, or confessed in humiliating detail. Those who struggled spiritually often lived in shame and fear, believing themselves to be broken or sinful. And yet, they stayed because leaving meant eternal condemnation, or because there was simply nowhere else to go. In the end, monastic life in ancient times was not the serene, contemplative existence often portrayed in romantic histories. It was a life of extreme discipline, isolation, hunger, discomfort, and self-denial. The monastery was not a refuge from the world, it was a world of its own, one built on rules, repetition, and renunciation. There was little space for joy and even less for change. As the years passed within the monastery walls, the initial hardship of adaptation gave way to a deeper, more persistent form of suffering isolation, not just from the outside world, but from the inner self. Life was no longer about personal growth or exploration, it became a slow erosion of individual will. Contact with the outside world was severely limited. Visitors were rare and often restricted to specific times and places. Letters were heavily censored or read aloud by superiors before being sent or received. The monastery was not just a religious institution, it was a system of control. News from the world arrived late, if at all. Monks who had once known families, friends, and cities slowly forgot the sounds and rhythms of the world beyond. Over time, even memories faded into a distant murmur behind the ever-present chanting and ritual. Books were locked in armaria, available only to a select few. Reading for pleasure was discouraged, if not forbidden outright. Even when permitted, the texts were predictable: saints' lives, psalters, biblical commentaries, and treatises on sin. There was no poetry, no drama, no fiction, no fresh ideas. For many monks, intellectual curiosity dulled with each passing season. The mind, once active and questioning, sank into numb repetition. Monks were expected to suppress emotion. Grief over the death of family was expressed only through silent prayer. Joy was suspect, as laughter could be seen as frivolous. Love, in any form outside divine devotion, was dangerous. Some monasteries enforced strict separation even between monks to prevent emotional bonds. Brotherly affection was permissible in theory but guarded in practice. Hugs, touches, or prolonged conversations were frowned upon. The fear of sin extended beyond actions to feelings. Temptation was everywhere, and the devil was believed to enter through even the smallest crack in discipline. Confession was both a necessity and a burden. It was not optional. Monks were required to confess not only actions but thoughts. Envy, pride, distraction, boredom all had to be spoken aloud to a superior. The process was humiliating, especially since no sin was ever considered too small. A wandering eye during Mass, a fleeting desire for rest, even a moment of nostalgia, all became fuel for spiritual reprimand. Privacy, even within one's own conscience, was denied. Monasteries operated under a rigid hierarchy. The abbot or prior held absolute authority. His word was law, and questioning it was a serious offense. Decisions were often final, and punishments could be arbitrary. Favoritism was not uncommon. Those with influential connections or family wealth before entering monastic life sometimes received better treatment. Others, especially those from peasant backgrounds, remained in servile roles for years, even decades, with little hope of advancement. Merit did not always guarantee respect. Rules governed every detail of life: how to walk, how to eat, when to speak, how to kneel, when to look down. Even gestures during prayer were standardized. Innovation, initiative, or independent thinking was discouraged. Creativity was not a virtue. Conformity was the ideal. The rule of Saint Benedict, or whichever rule the monastery followed, became the absolute blueprint, repeated and enforced endlessly. Deviations, even in intent, were corrected swiftly. Seasonal changes brought no real relief. In winter, monks endured bitter cold. Heating was scarce and usually reserved for communal areas or infirmaries. Blankets were thin. Firewood was rationed. Water for washing often froze. Fingers grew stiff and numb during manual labor, but the work did not stop. In summer, the heat was suffocating. Stone walls trapped warmth, and there was no means of cooling. Mosquitoes, flies, and other pests were constant, and windows lacked glass. Hygiene suffered, and infections spread more easily. There were no holidays as people know them today. Feast days meant longer services, more rituals, and often stricter fasting, not relaxation. While lay people celebrated with food, dancing, and community gatherings, monks remained cloistered, kneeling on hard stone floors, chanting Latin verses, and contemplating the suffering of saints. Even festivals meant penitence. Joy was to be found only in obedience, not in indulgence. Nighttime brought little comfort. Monks slept in shared dormitories on straw or wooden planks. There were no personal beds. Night prayers broke up sleep into fragments, leaving the body fatigued. The idea of a full night's rest was foreign. Dreams were viewed suspiciously, as possible signs of spiritual weakness or temptation. Some monks feared their own sleep, dreading what thoughts or images might appear without conscious control. Sickness was not met with compassion but with resignation. Illness was often seen as divine punishment or a test. Treatment was basic and sometimes superstitious. Herbs, fasting, or bloodletting were common practices. Monks who could not work were often marginalized. Care existed, but it was minimal and always tied to spiritual meaning rather than medical understanding. A prolonged illness could mean complete isolation or confinement to a dark cell to prevent disturbing others. Many monks spent years without touching another human being in kindness. Physical contact, even in the form of comfort, was rare. Discipline replaced affection. Encouragement was sparse. Spiritual progress was measured in how well one conformed, not in how well one grew. Guilt was a constant companion. Guilt for thinking, for feeling, for desiring something beyond duty. Even in prayer, monks were warned against letting their minds wander. But wander they did, and with each mental deviation came more guilt. Over time, the mind turned inward and stale. With no novelty, no stimulus, and no freedom, even thoughts became routine. The prayers, once fresh, became mechanical. The words lost their meaning. The silence, once contemplative, became oppressive. Some monks experienced despair, a condition known as aesthesia, a spiritual apathy so deep it was seen as demonic. It was not depression in the modern sense, but a kind of soul weariness. Aesthesia was feared because it led to disobedience, to daydreaming, to sloth. But it was common because the structure allowed little else. Some monasteries were located in desolate areas, atop mountains, deep in forests, or far from towns. Travel was rare, and leaving without permission was forbidden. The world became a map of stone walls, cloisters, and chapels. The landscape outside faded, and the seasons became more noticeable only through the changing temperatures and lengths of services. Many monks lived for years without seeing new people or places. The mind, denied novelty, folded inward. Communication with the divine was the ultimate goal, yet it was rarely achieved. Most monks did not experience visions or revelations. Instead, they toiled in obscurity, hoping their sacrifices had meaning. They were told that suffering would be rewarded after death, that obedience was the highest good, but many died without certainty. Their graves were plain, their lives recorded only in dusty ledgers or forgotten chants. They were anonymous by design. In every sense, the life of a monk in ancient times was one of negation, of freedom, of self, of comfort, of joy. It was a life of surrender, not to beauty or peace, but to silence, cold, and endless discipline. In theory, it was holy. In practice, it was often bleak. In the final analysis of monastic life in ancient times, it was not just the rules or routines that made it so difficult, it was the unrelenting nature of time itself. Time in the monastery did not move freely. It circled back on itself, repeating in endless cycles of prayer, labor, silence, and fasting. Days merged into weeks, weeks into seasons, and seasons into years, but little ever changed. The seasons changed, but the duties did not. The faces aged, but the expectations remained fixed. The bell that signaled each activity divided time into fragments too small for rest and too repetitive for meaning. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, these were not just prayer times but anchors around which all existence was tethered. The monks did not own their hours. Each was claimed in advance, regulated, and anticipated. Spontaneity was impossible. Planning personal goals was pointless. Nothing could be postponed or accelerated. Time became a burden, not a gift. Even special days brought no reprieve. On high feast days, services were longer and more demanding. Processions were more elaborate, chants were more extensive, and expectations were higher. There was always another obligation. Even sleep was shaped by ritual. The great silence ruled the night, but it was not restful. Monks often woke multiple times for prayers or vigils. They rose from wooden pallets, shivering, barely rested, and walked through dark corridors by candlelight, repeating psalms by memory. Aging in the monastery brought little comfort. The body weakened, but the rules remained. Older monks who could no longer work as field laborers were often reassigned to lighter duties, but these came with their own pressures. The copying of manuscripts required steady hands and clear vision. The maintenance of relics, gardens, or library inventories involved responsibility without reward. Illnesses increased, but medical understanding remained rudimentary. Toothaches became chronic. Arthritis went untreated. Coughs lingered for seasons. Infirmaries were bleak places. Often underheated and poorly ventilated, they were stocked with herbs, ointments, and vague remedies. The monks who cared for the sick were rarely trained. Their assistance, while well-intended, was based on outdated or spiritualized concepts of healing. Leeching, purging, and enforced fasting were common treatments. Pain was endured silently and death came without ceremony. No families visited. No final requests were honored. The dying monk was just another servant of the rule expected to suffer with discipline to the end. The vow of chastity, while lauded in sermons, brought intense private suffering. The denial of all physical affection, not just romantic or sexual, but even platonic touch, left deep emotional emptiness. Desires did not vanish simply because they were forbidden. Instead, they went underground, twisted by guilt and fear. In some monasteries, violations of chastity were harshly punished, sometimes with exile, whipping, or public penance. The absence of healthy emotional outlets caused psychological strain that many could not name or explain. Even the vow of poverty was a source of conflict. While monks were told they owned nothing, monasteries often accumulated wealth. Rich patrons donated land, gold, and relics, hoping to secure divine favor. Some monastic institutions became landlords over large territories, controlling peasants and collecting tithes. The contradiction between personal austerity and institutional affluence created tension. While monks ate cold turnips, the abbey stored barrels of wine for guests and dignitaries. Hypocrisy was not always addressed, questioning it risked punishment. The illusion of spiritual equality collapsed under the weight of hierarchy. The abbot had better clothes, more food, and greater comfort. His quarters were warmer, his bed softer, his days freer from labor. Meanwhile, lower-ranking monks endured harder work and stricter scrutiny. Though all monks knelt before the same altar, their experience of monastic life varied sharply depending on their rank and background. True humility was preached, but the structure itself ensured inequality. The silence, though often considered sacred, was not always peaceful. It silenced more than just speech, it silenced doubt, frustration, questions, and pain. Without the ability to speak freely, monks internalized their suffering. Mental illnesses went unnamed. Anxiety became sin. Depression became sloth. Joyless obedience was praised, and unhappiness was blamed on the monk's own weakness. There was no language for trauma and little understanding of emotional distress. The silence allowed suffering to go unnoticed and unaddressed. Many monks entered the monastery young, sometimes as children, given by parents who sought spiritual merit or could not afford to raise another mouth. These child oblates grew up in a world where obedience replaced affection and discipline replaced play. Their identities were shaped by rulebooks, not relationships. They never knew another way of living, and when doubts arose, there was nowhere to take them. By the time they reached adulthood, they were fully molded into the system with no concept of escape. The idea of escape itself was terrifying. To leave the monastery was not just to reject a building, it was to risk eternal damnation. The outside world was portrayed as a place of sin, temptation, and chaos. Stories were told of former monks who died in squalor or were seized by demons. Even those who longed for freedom feared the consequences. Some who fled were hunted down and returned in chains. Others were branded heretics. The psychological grip of the monastery extended far beyond its walls. Over the centuries, some reformers tried to improve the conditions to reduce corruption, ease rules, and offer more humane treatment. But reforms were slow and met with resistance. Change threatened tradition, and tradition was equated with holiness. The weight of the past pressed down on every aspect of monastic life. Innovations were discouraged, experiments condemned, and alternative views silenced. Even after death, the monk's anonymity persisted. Burials were simple, graves unmarked or modest. The name was not important, only the role. The monastery remembered the institution, not the individual. Year after year, new novices entered and old monks passed away, the cycle continuing unbroken. The prayers stayed the same. The rituals never changed. The silence remained absolute. In the final reckoning, the life of a monk in ancient times was not a path to transcendence for most, it was a narrow corridor lined with restriction, surveillance, and denial. Though it promised divine closeness, it often delivered only distance from others, from the world, and from the self. The life was not chosen freely by all, and for those who entered unwillingly or without understanding, the price was enormous. They gave up comfort, companionship, and control. They submitted to a system that monitored their actions, thoughts, and even dreams. Their days were consumed by repetition, their nights by discomfort, and their hopes by fear. They bore a life where time moved slowly and meaning rarely arrived. The monastery, for all its sacred purpose, was not a sanctuary from suffering, it was a factory of it. Sanctified by ritual and disguised in robes. And while it may have shaped history and preserved books, it did so at the cost of countless silent, invisible lives who endured, submitted, and vanished without a trace.